Welcome, everyone, to my May 13th webinar, Ideological Thinking, Are Some Brains Wired to Connect with Ideals? I got onto this topic because it's been on my mind for quite some time that in our very divided society, which is divided on social and political issues, it's valuable to ask the question, are people, well, the first question is, why do some people believe in ideologies and others do not? And the question is, could that have a basis in brain physiology? Are some people literally hardwired to think in terms of ideologies, while others have flexible thinking and the option to move in any direction that thinking takes them and events take them? And I thought this was a really interesting question because it seems that some people, we all have friends, um, who are just free free reined, just free ranged. They can just take things along as they come. They see them as they are, or at least their view of what they are. But they're not tied to particular lines of thought. Whereas other people, believe things very strongly. Some of those things are social prejudices, racial prejudices, um, religious prejudices. So there's all of this stuff that people get tied up in. And before we, criticize people, um, we want to, be able to treat them fairly, but we've got to have an understanding of where they're coming from so that it makes sense, so to speak, to us that, oh, they have this particular point of view. This is how they think, and there's not much we can do about it. I know people um, whose thinking really quite shocks me sometimes, the stuff that they believe. One of my favorites is the thing about contrails. Contrails are the vapor trails that jet airplanes leave in the sky sometimes when the conditions up high where the airplanes are, 30, 40,000 feet up, wherever they are. Um, when the conditions are just right, then the water vapor condenses behind jet engines and leaves a streak across the sky. That can be quite beautiful. Pardon me. And there are those people who believe that those streaks are the result of the jet airplanes releasing toxins into the atmosphere that they have stored and have carried up into the atmosphere with them, intentionally. That is to say that they're put in tanks and then dumped on the populace, dumped into the atmosphere there, so it spreads across the earth, for all kinds of nefarious purposes. And it's one of those conspiracy theories that is, I think, particularly fallacious on its surface. Yet people believe in it and are very deeply committed to it. And once they believe it, they hold on to it rigidly, and nothing you can do will talk them out of it. And they'll cite all these reports and testimonials that people have given about how they're the ones who put the chemicals into the airplanes and so on and so forth. Um, but there's just all of this kind of what really is on its surface, from a logical point of view, is nonsense. But they can find compelling arguments to justify believing that contrails are dangerous to human populations and are part of a conspiracy to control human behavior. Um, so why do people think like that? I mean, I think that's a curious thought. It's a thought that's worthy of consideration. So in this webinar, we're going to explore ideological thinking, and we'll see how it's central to political opinion, social structure, and religious dogma. And we'll present some options for questioning our ideological thinking and releasing it so as to be able to embrace nature's intelligence which is really the goal of the webinar. Um, Flexible thinking is fundamental to receiving and manifesting nature's guidance, while rigidity in thinking binds one to identifying with specific ideologies and specific ideas about how things are. And this is how they are, like that. And no evidence will prevail against them. Now, why do we need ideological thinking? Why is it a good thing? Well, we need rules to understand how our world operates, the whole universe operates. The whole basis of science is that there are rules in nature. We call them laws of nature. They're not written down and they're not made up. They're inherent in the structure of creation. And all of our sciences are based on trying to discern these specific rules that govern um, the universe, govern everything about our lives, and even rules in psychology. So the rules about how people act, and then of course how people should act. And when you get into that domain and you start thinking about why is there creation and so forth, then you get into the domain of religion. And so religion is just full of dogma, we call it, teachings, religious teachings. Maybe we shouldn't call it dogma, but religious teachings, which tell us usually there's a creation story, and then there's stories about a deity or deities, and there can be many stories. Pardon me, and um, there's a whole bunch of rules about practice and what it means to be religious and to be part of the group. There's often a lot of judgment and, built into it is frequently, well, not always, but frequently some sense of shame and guilt from misbehavior, which is called, of course, sinning. Um, and that can be laid on pretty heavy, as it is, in our Western world quite strongly. I'm not that familiar with Eastern thinking, but in the Western world, the idea of sin is very strong. And people feel that while they feel that it's God's responsibility to punish people, they often feel that it's humans' responsibility to punish them too. So there's a great deal of judgment hurled at people, and oftentimes physical and emotional punishment. So religion fits into this whole schema of ideological thinking. We have certain ideas or rules about ideologies, about how our universe works. And that applies locally in terms of our families and our interactions socially, and then how communities are organized and governments are organized, particularly, the philosophy around the formation of the modern American government, well, not modern American, the American government, back in the days of the Revolutionary War. There was a great deal of thinking that went into what does government do? What's the purpose of government, and what are its roles? And how do you create a government that actually is going to serve the people? Which was a radical thought, because before that they were living under the rule of kings, and kings didn't think about you know uh, the well-being of people, other than that they should be well enough off not to revolt. So the structure of a social society and a government to govern that society, is a major area of ideological thinking. Um, but what about the link between ideological thinking and brain anatomy? I'm not going to go through the details of that. I think that's very technical, and I'm certainly no expert in that. But flexible thinkers have been found to have more dopamine in their prefrontal cortexes, the area where we do our intellectual thinking, and have our sense of purpose and being. Um, while rigid thinkers tend to have larger amygdalae. Amygdala is a small area of the brain, um, and it's has a lot to do with how we perceive the world in terms of rules. Um, so people with a larger amygdala tend to have ideological thinking. Now the question has to immediately be, come to mind: are the amygdala bigger in those people because that's how they think, or do people think that way because their amygdalas are bigger? And thus there might be a biological evolutionary thing where some people have more flexibility, and that gets manifested by certain ways in which the brain functions, particularly in terms of how much dopamine is present in the prefrontal cortex, and how much the amygdala controls thinking and gives us a predisposition to ideological thinking and what we would call rigid thinking. Um, think about that for a moment. That's what I was doing, was pausing just to consider that, because I've been considering this and considering it. The science doesn't have an answer for us yet. It doesn't know about cause and effect. There are just these correlations that have been noted in people based on the scans that are done and the kind of thinking that people display. Um, but um, if a person is prone to ideological thinking, then they're prone to believing things which may or may not be true, but they will find justification for their beliefs. And it works that way. That is to say, the belief comes first and then the justifications come. And that's the way science works, right? Is that we look at something and we say, we make a hypothesis, we call it. That's an idea or a belief about how things work. And then we run experiments to try to figure out whether or not it's true. And we tend to embrace those results that support our hypothesis, our belief, our rule about how things function. And we tend to reject those things which do not support our belief. But our belief tends to be the thing that guides us. And so even scientists are prone to ideological thinking. We call it scientific thinking, but they form a hypothesis. They have a set of hypotheses. There are certain coherent viewpoints and rules about how nature operates. And then um, from there, we develop, whole experimental backup to support our beliefs. But if we're really good scientists, then when data does not support our beliefs, um, we probably initially get upset, and then we figure out, well, if that's not the case, then what is? What is the bigger picture? What are the rules that govern this particular phenomenon that I'm interested in? And so science has a very big role in both flexible thinking, but in ideological thinking as well, because it's rule oriented. Laws of nature. It's looking for the laws of nature, trying to understand nature. So that's the basic hypothesis. And I don't really have an answer for you tonight. But what I really want to do is to think about ideological thinking and how we can free our thinking so that we're not so attached to it. In other words, I want to move the discussion away from the science, so to speak, of brain physiology and focus more on behavioral issues and the idea that what ideological thinking is attachment to certain ideas, and that attachment is the antithesis of enlightenment. In enlightenment, we gain a freedom from a bondage to our experience, so we're open to the experiences however it comes, and those experiences can be pretty amazing, but they're not always rational. They don't always fit the regular worldview that is the commonly accepted worldview. Um, and so to gain that flexibility, it's not like so immediately obvious. Well, we know that from Maharshi's teaching and other teaching of other gurus, that taking the awareness from a surface level of thinking where the laws of sensory perception apply, and going to a level of subtle perception and subtlest perception, and eventually being able to get to a level where we're just established in being, just pure basis of thought, but no thoughts themselves. In that state, we have maximum flexibility. And then all the laws of nature can flow through us, through our awareness. And so we can conceive of things that we had not otherwise been able to conceive of, things that did not fit our scientific worldview. And when I say scientific here, I mean ideological worldview, that rigid view of the world. So gaining that state of freedom is a marvelous thing and a rare thing, really. But people who practice transcendental meditation that Maharshi brought out have a mechanism for experiencing that again and again and again, and gradually developing that ability to have the flexibility of the nervous system, the infinite flexibility, Maharshi would call that, so that we can go this way and that, and perceive what nature wants us to see and hear and feel, taste, and smell, as well as the unbounded state of pure being. And I'm pausing there because I'm stepping out of all of this thinking and just getting into that level of being, just that state. Now, how do we do that on a practical level, particularly when we're engaged in something? I was engaged today in some political discussion with some folks, and it was fun. It was something to do with people. So it was sociable. But I noticed that each person had a particular viewpoint, and they were just sharing viewpoints, and it was lovely. It's a nice thing to do. But there was no underlying truth to it. Each person just had a different way of looking at things, and there were different ideas about what should be done and how we might go about doing it, and so on and so forth. But the idea of that there was some underlying both ideology and flexibility, that wasn't part of the discussion. And so I'm sitting there thinking about the webinar I'm about to do this at lunchtime, and I was thinking about that, and then thinking about how these people were discussing. And I kind of wanted to give the webinar right there on the spot, but I didn't do it. But the idea is that we can move out of that rigid thinking. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to give you step by step in the group clearing session. But right now, it just suffice it to say that what we do is we question. We question the things that we believe to be true. Now, some things will be perfectly obvious. Yesterday, there was a full moon. It was beautiful, by the way. I thought it was beautiful, but beautiful is completely subjective interpretation of the experience. There was a full moon. How do I know that there was a full moon? Well, I saw it. And, okay, that's one piece of evidence. I read about it and about what kind of moon it was and so on and so forth. Kind of moon means where the moon was in relation to the Earth. And so there was more evidence of that. And then, there's all the learning that I've done over the years about how the moon goes around the Earth goes around the sun. And, the different phases of the moon has to do with where the moon is in relation to the sun and what we can see of it. And so, there's a whole lot of lifelong learning behind that. So to answer that question, how do I know? Well, there's all this evidence. There's all this data. And while any one piece of it might not be reliable, it becomes pretty believable when you see that. So there's a rule, right? That, there was a full moon last night, and that's, you know, pretty reliable information. Now, a lot of the information that we get is not that reliable. Um, Information about, many of our social problems. I'm not going to go into any one specific one right now, but information about our social problems and how we might go about fixing them. Well, there's a lot of different viewpoints. There's a lot of different um, theories, you might say, ideas about how things work and how they might change. Maybe the government is too inefficient and just too big, and what we might do to change that, and yet still be able to maintain, the useful functions of government. Well, we're not really sure what those useful functions are because most of us don't even know what they are. We have very little idea about what our government actually does, the myriad things that it does. And so it's a complex problem, and it doesn't have a simple solution. So you wind up facing people with ideologies, that is, particular belief systems about how the government ought to function, or how politicians ought to function, or how judges ought to function, or anything else. So, confronted with those beliefs, um, we have to figure out, how do we move forward? And do we do so by trying to develop more rules to explain it? Or do we do it from a level of flexibility, infinite flexibility, hopefully, so that we're completely open to letting nature guide our thinking and guide our action in the face of all of that? So that's the basic idea for tonight. Um, and I'm just reading a note somebody sent me here. I'm not going to repeat it. Um, but if there are any comments or questions that people have, please go ahead and put them in the chat function. I'll just, while you're composing, I'll just talk for a moment. Um, our next webinar will be June 10th, unless I'm forced to change that because of things that are happening. It strikes me that June is a very busy month for stuff, so I'm not sure, but we're aiming for June 10th. That's a second Tuesday of June. And I'm going to do a webinar called New Views of ADHD and Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. I read a very interesting article. I'll probably make some comments from the article about how ADHD and hyperactivity um, uh, are on a spectrum, and it struck me that that's fills in something that is building in the theory that I have about human behavior, that it's where we live on several spectra. One of them is the autism spectrum, um, and uh, the other is the narcissism spectrum. And it seems like there's an ADHD spectrum as well. And you can explain most behavior as representing expressions of these particular characteristics, some to a greater degree, some to a lesser degree. Somebody put the term cognitive bias in the chat. Cognitive bias, of course, is basically bringing ideological thinking into any particular question or discussion. Um, it means having a predetermined point of view, a prejudiced point of view. So it's a cognitive bias. Um, and, we can have social biases and we can have cognitive biases, believing certain things to be true. We'll explore in the group clearing session how we get rid of those. But basically, we ask the question, is this true? Is this true? Okay, with that, I will bring this recording to a close, and we'll take a brief, short break. Again, our next webinar, save the date, June 10th, New Views of ADHD.